So most of the story goes on. Most of them from wealthy Indian families wore blazers, caps, and ties. So most of these boys, it was an all boys school. So most of the boys they were from wealthy Indian families, and they were used to wear blazers, caps, and ties. Right. So think of the Birla school in Simla, right? Or any boarding school which is in hill stations, and so in most cases only wealthy people are able to send their kids to it. So it was that kind of school, a bit of elite school, right? Life magazine, in a feature of India, had once called it the Eton of the East. So, Life magazine is a famous magazine, it still publishes issues even today. So, Life magazine, even back then, it's according to the story, it featured in a feature on India. So, when it featured a specific issue on India, it had called this particular school in which Mr. Oliver teaches as the Eton of the East. Eton is a very famous and a very old English public school based in London, right? So it compared this particular school to an Eton, to the Eton school in England, in London. So you can understand the sense of eliteness, the sense of respect that this particular school held even at that time. Mr. Oliver had been teaching in the school for several years. So it gives us more information about Mr. Oliver, that he had been teaching in this particular school for quite some years. The Simla Bazaar, with its cinemas and restaurants, was about 3 miles from the school, and Mr. Oliver, a bachelor, usually strolled into the town in the evening. Stroll as in to walk easily, right? In Hindi it's called tehelna, right? Strolling is called tehelna. So strolled into the town in the evening, tehelte शाम को वो town में पहुंच जाते थे. Because remember, this school is on the outskirts of the Simla. Returning after dark, when he would take a shortcut through the pine forest. So the Simla Bazaar, which had cinemas and restaurants, it was about 3 miles from the school. And Mr. Oliver, who was a bachelor, as in he was not married, he usually strolled in the evening towards from the school towards the Simla Bazaar. He walked to it and returned after dark, and he wouldn't take the normal route. He would take a shortcut which went through a pine forest, right? When there was a strong wind, the pine trees made sad, eerie sounds. Eerie as in a bit of not uncomfortable, but rather strange, weird, chilling sounds. That spooks people, that makes some people fearful, right? So it made sad, eerie sounds that kept most people to the main road. But Mr. Oliver was not a nervous or imaginative man. So when the shortcut that the writer is talking about, which went through the pine forest, so when the storm at night, when there's a strong wind, so because the pine trees, the leaves of the pine trees are like are needle like, right? So they made very sad, eerie sound when the wind passed through the trees, and which because of it most people were a bit afraid, and they kept to the main road, they followed the main road. But Mr. Oliver, he was not a nervous or imaginative man, as in he didn't believe in the paranormal, he didn't believe in ghosts or things like that. He carried a torch and its gleam as in its light. The batteries were running down, moved fitfully down the narrow forest path. Fitfully as in not in a specific constant manner, but fitfully as in it kept on going. It kept on going bright and then low and then bright again. And because he was walking, the beam of the light was going up and down. So it moved fitfully down the narrow forest path when its flickering light fell in the figure of a boy. Flickering again because the batteries were running low, so the brightness of the torchlight was sometimes increasing, sometimes decreasing, and this flickering light fell on the figure of a boy who was sitting alone on a rock. Mr. Oliver stopped. Boys were not supposed to be out after dark. So he was carrying a torch, and because the batteries were running low, and because he was walking with the torch in his hand, the beam of the beam of the torch light, right, its gleam, its brightness, its light was moving fitfully. It was moving up and down, left and right a bit, as per the movement of his body, and it was flickering a little bit, as in the brightness was increasing and decreasing because of the low running batteries. And he was walking towards the school when the beam of the torchlight fell on it illuminated a boy sitting on a rock, and he stopped. Mr. Oliver stopped because he thought that it's quite late in the night, and boys are not supposed to be out of the school at this particular time. "What are you doing out here, boy?" asked Mr. Oliver sharply, moving closer so that he could recognize the miscreant. He asked the boy, "What are you doing here, boy?" And he sharply, as in with a bit of authority and dislike, not dislike, but a bit of authority, and in order to instill, in order to make the other person feel or understand that he is serious, he is not joking around. He spoke sharply. He asked this particular question, "What are you doing here, boy?" sharply, and he moved closer so that he could recognize the miscreant, as in the mischief doer, right, the one who does mischief. But even as he approached the boy, Mr. Oliver sensed that something was wrong. The boy appeared to be crying, but as he moved towards the boy, Mr. Oliver sensed that something is not right over here, because the boy, his back was towards Mr. Oliver, and from the movement of his shaking shoulders, it appeared that he was crying. His head hung down, he held his face in his hands, and his body shook convulsively. Convulsively, as in it was like a person who is really crying and his body is shaking in convulsions, right? It was a strange, soundless weeping, and Mr. Oliver felt distinctly uneasy, as in specifically uneasy. So when he moved closer to the boy, he found that the boy's head was down. He was crying like this with his face in his hands, and his body was shaking, but there was no sound. So that is why Mr. Oliver felt a bit uneasy, because it was a soundless crying, right, weeping, and it was quite uneasy and strange. "Well, what's the matter?" he asked, his anger giving away to concern. So when he saw that the boy was crying, so he felt a certain amount of concern and pity in his heart, and the anger that he felt initially when he asked the boy, "What are you doing here?" right, that turned to concern, and he asked, "Well, what's the matter? What are you crying for?" The boy would not answer or look up. He kept on asking these questions. The boy still would not look up, or neither he would answer. His body continued to be racked with silent sobbing. Racked, as in to be punished with, as in racked. Okay, racked over here means to put someone on rack is to put someone on a bit of a torture, and it was a type of punishment that was quite prevalent in the medieval times of England, right? So that's where the term ragged comes from. Ragged, as in it appeared that he was going through this silent sobbing. "Come on, boy, you shouldn't be out here at this hour. Tell me the trouble. Look up." The boy looked up. So he said, "Come on, you shouldn't be out here at this particular hour. It's so late in the night. Tell me what's troubling you. Look up." And the boy, when he said look up, the boy did look up. He took his hands from his face and looked up at his teacher. When he was crying like this, so when Mr. Oliver said look up, he put down his hand, and he looked up to Mr. Oliver, right, to his teacher, because remember, the boy was wearing the school uniform. The light from Mr. Oliver's torch fell on the boy's face, if you could call it a face. When Mr. Oliver put the beam of the light on the boy's face, Mr. Oliver was a bit startled, because it was not what you will call a normal face, because this is we understand from this particular line, if you could call it a face. It had no eyes, ears, nose or mouth. It was just a round, smooth head with a school cap on top of it. And that's where the story should end. But for Mr. Oliver, it did not end here. So when the light fell on the boy's face, what Mr. Oliver saw that made him so filled with fear and surprised and extremely difficult to understand what is happening in front of it. What happened was that he saw that there was it cannot be called a face, the boy's face, because it had no eyes, no ears, no nose, no mouth, nothing. It appeared like the forehead continued till the neck. It was a smooth face without anything, right, and just a cap on it. And this is where the story should have ended, right? But for Mr. Oliver, the story continued a little bit further. The torch fell from his trembling hand. Because the trembling hand, because he was shaking with fear. He turned and scrambled down the path, running blindly through the trees and calling for help. He was still running towards the school buildings when he saw a lantern swinging in the middle of the path. So he left his torch where he was standing. He started running in fear back towards the school, the outline of the school building, and throughout the entire way he was running and he was calling for help. And he was still running towards the school building when he saw a light, the light of a lantern which was swinging on the path in front of him. Mr. Oliver stumbled up to the watchman, gasping for breath. So it appeared that when you hold the lantern, it's quite close towards the ground. So it only highlights about half of your body. So whoever was holding, only half of his body was in light, was illuminated by the lantern light. And from the uniform and the overall appearance, it looked that it was a watchman. So Mr. Oliver stumbled up to him and stopped and started gasping for breath. That is, he was started heaving lungfuls of air, right? What is it, Sahib? Asked the watchman. Has there been an accident? Why are you running? So the watchman, obviously in a very concerned manner, asked, what is it, Sahib? What is it? Kya hua? Right? Has there been an accident that you are running so blindly? Why are you running? I saw something horrible. A boy weeping in the forest and he had no face. Mr. Oliver said, I saw something. I am running in order to answer that particular watchman's question. Mr. Oliver said, I saw something quite horrible. I saw a boy who was who was crying in the forest, and the most strange part of the fearful part of it was that he had no face. So the watchman asked, no face, Sahib? The watchman said, he didn't have any face, Sahib. So again Mr. Oliver said, no eyes, nose, mouth, nothing. So he still startled. He said, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, nothing. There was nothing on his face. So then what does the watchman does? He pulls up the lantern towards his face. He says, do you mean it was like this, Sahib? Asked the watchman and raised the lamp to his own face. He raised the lamp to his own face and he said, do you mean it was the face that you saw in the forest? It was like this, like my face. The watchman had no eyes, no ears, no features at all. Because and this is the really goosebumpy moment, because the watchman, the person whom Mr. Oliver found, and he thought that, okay, now I am saved because I found another person, and that person also has no face. It's the same type of creature that the boy was. Not even an eyebrow. The watchman had not even an eyebrow, and that's when the wind blew the lamp out. And that's when he was holding the watchman was holding the lamp up, and he has asked, what do you mean it was like this, Sahib? And then there was a strong wind and the lamp's light was blown off, right? So it blew out and there was complete darkness. So now the writer gives the control back to you to imagine what had happened, right? So I'll be sending the assignment to it about this story along with the video. Thank you, class.